Hello, everybody, and welcome to another conversation in our series on seeking harmony. Today is part 21, and we are looking at a number of topics that have come up over the last week or so in relation to what's really happening in the world today. And so one of the things that probably stood out for me quite a bit was the death of the immigrants in Texas, and I can't remember where in Texas, but yeah, I read it and I don't remember, I quite remember the name, but yeah, so I know the team knows. So I think that's one of the things that really stood out for me, and it was in relation to what the potential immigration laws are in the US that has impacted the ability of asylum seekers to move to what would be safety, because that's really generally the baseline premise of what an asylum seeker's intention would be. So I think one of the things that stood out is just that there's obviously concerns around what those policies are in the US, and I think the team can probably tell us more in terms of what those policies are and how they impact the ability of asylum seekers, specifically from Mexico, to move into the US under the protection of the United States. So I'm going to open it up to the team, and I'm going to ask them to share their views, and we will take it from there. So thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Yeah, I know that based on what I was reading, it was this the story is basically that, there was a policy that the Donald Trump administration started, and people call it colloquially, it's the Remain in Mexico policy. And I think this just applies to Mexican and Central American immigrants. But it's saying that if someone is coming from like Central America up to the US seeking asylum, like normally in the past, they could stay in the US while they waited on their court date, because there would have to be like a trial or the court would have to hear their case and be like, is asylum granted or is it not? And the new policy was to have them wait in Mexico while they were waiting for their court date. And I was, I didn't know about this, that some people would be waiting there for a long time. Like there's one woman who's waiting for 2.5 years, in Mexico to have a court date in the United States about being granted asylum. And so, it just, raises questions about maybe like, what is most compassionate for the US to do? Is the US right in having this? Is this just a healthy boundary for the US? Or is it perhaps more like xenophobic? And that would be the questions. And well, just remembering that nobody in this situation is powerless, but the policy maybe could stand to be changed if it's not compassionate for people. And the reason being that while people are in Mexico, basically the same like members of a drug cartel or people in criminal gangs could, harass them as before, the same people as before. So I don't know. So I was wondering what you guys feel about that when you feel into it. Like, what do you feel is the truth of that situation? Oh, and the specific case was that. Sorry, I wanted to mention that some people were being smuggled by people affiliated with the drug cartels. They were just being smuggled in like a tractor trailer that wasn't cooled down. And it was, outside of San Antonio, Texas. They it was too hot in there for them. And so most of them didn't survive that trip. Yeah. So.
Yeah, so like, the first thing that kind of stood out for me was like, you watch all these random movies about people being smuggled in tankers and tanks and in containers and all that. And that was kind of the image that I had. And, like, I agree with you that the bigger question is obviously, what is compassionate under these circumstances? Yes, there are laws, and yes, there are requirements for the cases to be heard and those kind of things. But where does humanity really begin? Especially given that if they, and I just read it, it was called the Migration Protection Protocols. I did, because I actually went and looked for it. Yeah, Migrant Protection Protocol. So, like, I mean, when you say something like that, what protection are we actually referring to? If this is a law from the Trump era of administration. And yeah, it was just like the feeling I have is of quite horrific circumstances. So, like, at the core of it, I have to ask the question of, like, well, where is the humanity? Where does the humanity begin or end? And as you said, we all have the responsibility of having, and we all have the power to make certain choices. But at the same time, if you are also under countries where your life is under threat and things like that, how long is that piece of string, and how many people are required to actually step in and kind of shorten that piece of string in order to create safe spaces for other people. So, like, I get it, like, it's kind of dual-edged, because you would hear probably people of the country going, well, they're taking jobs and all those kind of things. But then again, are they safe? What are policies around asylum seekers? And under those circumstances, can we afford as countries to provide temporary housing and those kind of things so that we remove the imminent danger? So those are the kind of things that kind of crop up in my mind that made me really pay attention to this. And it's not specific to the US, because yes, that's the case that we like reading about, but I mean, it's happened in many countries. And in South Africa, we've had xenophobic attacks because of foreign people coming into the country, and our own people saying, well, they're taking our jobs and that kind of thing. And there's been xenophobic attacks. There's been the requirement to improve policing at borders and all those kind of things. So there's many considerations, and the duty of care of a country to its citizens. How far does it extend to citizens that are not of that country?
I agree with you on the fact that it's definitely not a US problem, because we have had a lot in the Mediterranean Sea and in the English Channel, between France and the European Union and the UK. And my question is, like, obviously, border control is always a sensitive question. Like, there's always a security question, and that's why it's there. But in all this situation, in all these places where there are true migrant crises in the world, like, whose responsibility it is to ensure, like, protection and safety from the people who travel is what, like, stood out for me, and it's kind of the same as what you were saying. And I just want to mention that after we've decided on that topic, the Supreme Court ruled that we could let go of that policy of the Trump administration era. So remain in Mexico might not stay in place after Biden. And I know like the ruling of the Supreme Court seems a little bit like out of place, at this time, because of everything that's happening. But I think it's really important to note that for many people, like remain in Mexico as it is, like as it has been experienced, is not something that feels good to many, and there's definitely something to do about it, because like we can't let people get kidnapped for ransoms at the border, waiting for their right or not to go into a country, for years, with money that they don't have. And so, yeah, that's definitely a crisis that people want to resolve, I feel. But like, how are we gonna resolve it is a big question, because the way it's going to be handled is something that is going to have an impact on the world, because that is going to have an impact on probably responses in every migrant crisis that we have in Europe and on other continents. Yeah, so that was my feeling.
Yeah, and I feel like I don't know. It's interesting because some, I don't want to say. Well, I guess everybody is manifesting situations that they're manifesting a situation that matches with something that in their vibration, like that they're choosing inside. And so, there is that. And so everyone needs to like respond to that, like what their reality is showing them. But, I think that it's important to have, like in the world in general, like to have compassion for people, because yeah, like people in spiritual truth, nobody's a victim. They manifest these situations, but that doesn't mean that you can't, that doesn't mean that it's not right for you to extend a compassionate hand and offer people some help, like to essentially make a new choice and like get themselves out of that situation, that experience. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like, there's kind of some crises people understand as being like, let me say this, some migrants people understand as being like very deserving of shelter. Like, with the Ukraine, there's a migrant crisis with Ukrainians, who are fleeing the country, right? Because Russia is invading Ukraine. And I feel like, a lot of European countries are just like, from what I've seen, are like very like open-hearted, because they're like, Russia attacked your country, and you need somewhere to go because you can't stay in Ukraine. And I feel, when I like feel into that feels really like uplifting for my heart and light. And it feels very joyful, because it's so beautiful to see other humans having compassion, for people, And so I really like that. And then I feel like, depending on your context, sometimes people they're not aware of what's going on. Like that, that in another country, there's also a war, but maybe it's more of like, a gang type of war, like, or based on like gangs that are trafficking drugs or whatever. And that is threatening people. And so, there's maybe less awareness. And then there's maybe a feeling of like that some people are like characterized as not being as deserving And I think it's up to them to like claim their worth and claim their humanity, you know, to be like, no, like we deserve compassion as well, you know. So I'm just comparing like in the US, like sometimes, you know, immigrants from Central America or Mexico kind of get like portrayed as just, they get portrayed badly, you know, versus like a Ukrainian migrant in Europe is being portrayed or being seen as like very deserving of some compassion, right, in this situation. So
something that you've shared, and I think it was something that came up at the time in terms of, and I think it was one or other news report where somebody was actually saying, well, you know, with the Ukrainians, like these are people like us. These are people that would have had the same life to us and those kind of things. And the biggest question that popped up was, well, if they were refugees from an African country, for instance, would they be people like you, and would you be as compassionate? And I think that's what you're speaking to, is that's this energy of judging the deservingness of others based on potentially skin color, based potentially on socioeconomic background. And so I feel like there is a requirement for us to let go of that energy of the difference, that energy of it's okay for certain people to be have-nots, where it's okay for others to be where it's okay for some to be have-nots, and it's not okay for others to be have-nots. There's kind of this dual standard and this dual level of acceptance of people or non-acceptance of people that I find still kind of is probably slightly pervasive in the way certain news articles are written and seen and shared and that kind of thing. So I do believe that there's a greater, I think there's a great, for me, it feels like there's a greater requirement to accept the humanity of people from all walks of life. It's something that is probably quite core to the work that we're doing here and having this discussion, in seeking the harmony between ourselves and others, and even within ourselves. It's kind of letting go of putting too much stock into that energy of differences. And it's something that we discussed quite at length through our various conversations in the Black Lives Matter discussions. So I feel like it's a good place to just surface it again and to maybe unpack, like, you know, at which point does compassion not extend as much as we would like it to?
yeah, I know. And like I never really like hear or get like an actual rational assessment of like what the United States' capacity is to take in refugees. Like I never hear about that. Like, what is the actual capacity? It's more just like, what is the attitude toward them, you know? But granted, like, I don't think countries should just take in people irrespective of, like, you know what I mean? It's a two-way relationship ultimately, although someone just coming out of like a horrible situation like that, they need to get on their feet. They need a chance to get on their feet, because that's compassion, you know? But yeah, I feel like in terms of, it's not just something that can be talked to people about. It's something that can be healed, you know, on the part of the refugees, like claiming their power and their worth and their humanness and divinity. And also, I feel like when it comes to accepting some and rejecting others, it's that, yeah, there's a part of yourself who, like, you accept some parts of yourself, but you don't accept other parts or something, you know? And yeah, so, and that can all be healed. And it's something that I'm like, we're all actively healing. Like I'm actively healing that kind of stuff too, where I have healed it because I know for a fact that based on my healing, for myself, like I've experienced this really gentle, compassionate journey, and I haven't experienced a lot of discrimination for myself, because it would be on my mind, like, oh, people might, I don't know, be mean to me because I'm transgender or something. And, or, well, I'm like, no, I really don't experience that, because I always love myself there. I actively work on that, you know. It's something that ultimately everyone can do. So yeah, whereas like I feel like these issues are always talked about like not in terms of that, you know what I mean, that everyone has a piece to heal in it. But yeah, so it's more just like, you're not compassionate, you're this, you're that, change this policy, do that, blah blah blah, you know, versus, you know, doing the inner healing about it. Just wanted to mention that. Yeah.
Yeah, so I just want to check in with the rest of the team. How do you feel about this? I mean, for me, there's a sense that yes, we can do the inner work, but there's also a sense that there has to be there are shifts required in our reality, and our reality does shift as we do the inner work. But there's a greater requirement for us to understand that we are global citizens, and so as global citizens, and as countries, what level of responsibility do we have to other countries and the citizens of other countries?
I mean, I can't speak for, you know, any other countries, but, you know, speaking in the state of what's happening in the US, just like what Yureen brought up about, you know, Biden was granted the allowance to end the Remain in Mexico policy from the Trump era. So that, in my eyes, is a step in a way. But again, there's more to come with that, obviously. Of course, in other countries, I don't know any knowledge of what's happening in the other countries, but I can only speak for, you know, the US.
I would say it's a difficult question because we have to acknowledge our oneness, you know, the fact that we're global citizens. And at the same time, we have to acknowledge like our choice to be from a certain country and to live in a certain country. And so like, yeah, how do you treat people that want to change country for whatever reason? I don't know. What's coming to mind right now is that wouldn't they deserve like you know, ways to access that new nationality? How can that be handled? And you know, policy for like being granted access to a country may vary from a nation to another. Like it's more difficult to enter certain countries than others. And yeah, would then there be like a minimum requirements for countries to welcome other people, because migration are not going to stop, they're just going to accelerate, because that's the world we live in. So yeah, but there is this you know, relationship between like our oneness and our choice of being in a country that comes at play. And obviously humanity is a question that is at the middle of all of that. I don't think we will have like a definitive answer in the short term, but I hope that we can like work that, and that Remain in Mexico will not remain, and that there can be another response afterwards. I think people would really like to have another kind of response and policy afterwards. That's what I feel. Yeah, Isaiah, what do you feel?
Yeah, I agree that there has to, like what Sage was saying too, there has to be compassion. There has to be a compassionate option for everyone in these situations. And it's just not the policy that's here right now. It's just not compassionate to have people waiting for years in Mexico, and it's not safe. And I'm glad that it seems like it's going to be overturned under Biden, because yeah, I feel like the policy needs to be much more compassionate than what it is. And I think that for other countries too, they need to adopt the same type of mentality as well. That it needs to be, we need to consider the humanity of people that want to immigrate over.
I think you've touched on something quite important in just when we start to consider people's humanity. And then we start to see things like a mass shooting at an Independence Day rally kind of thing. You kind of have to wonder, like, where or what got in the way of that person considering the humanity of other people. Like, you're literally celebrating your country at that point. And on that day, an 18-year-old, I think it's between, the person is between 18 and 20, does a mass shooting thing. And you're like, you have to wonder, like, we've got all these laws that we have the right to associate, we have the right to freedom, we have the right to bear arms, but at what cost? And I feel like that it's something that we never really consider the cost consequences of some of these laws. Like, yes, it's okay to bring people into our country, but at what cost? What is it costing our country? How long do you look after them? How do you gainfully help them be? How do you help them be gainfully employed, even if they're just covering the cost of their stay? Because otherwise it needs to be funded somewhere or from something. And I'm not arguing for laws that don't allow people into countries. I'm arguing that there's always a cost benefit. And we kind of need to consider what those costs are. And yes, there's a cost of life if you leave them to wait for a case for 5 years, for a case to be heard for 5 years. So I want us to almost shift our focus into, do we have a life structure that is so focused on the cost of things that we've lost the benefit of our humanity?
That I was kind of gonna touch on that a little bit, because what I was feeling after Isaiah spoke was like, ultimately, like, what do we value as nations? And I know we've talked a little bit about that before. I know Jeff and Shaleia talked a little bit about that. Like the United States, for example, very value like independence and individuality, but not so much a collective, and entrepreneurship rather than, social laws. For instance, it might be a little bit different, and another country might be a little bit different as well. But where do you enter the cost, the human cost of things? And that's something that we can see in immigration laws, in gun control laws, in climate change laws. Like, where is the human cost? And where does it take effect? Because you might not see the cost in the money and currencies that you use right now, but there's definitely a cost, which is our lives and our safety and our comfort as human beings on Earth. So there is definitely a bad thing to consider. And I think an ideal system would start to enter that humanity and human cost as a value into the equation of all things. But yeah, that's my take on it. Like, what do you guys feel about that?
When you were talking, Irene, it made me think about this social media post that I saw for July 4th. There's this actress, not everyone knows who she is, but I'm sure everyone here probably would know this actress by the name of Jessica Chastain. She posted this picture on Instagram for Independence Day, and the quote says, "Happy Independence Day from me and my reproductive rights," and it's a picture of her flipping the bird. So it's I'd say it's like a, what's the word to describe it? There's a collective anger, if that makes sense. For her, I mean, for her, this public figure, this Academy Award-winning, big worldwide actress to do something like that, it's like, wow, okay. So yeah, I would say, yeah, so there's a collective like hate and anger happening when it comes to quote unquote independence.
Yeah, a very big upheaval. It's kind of like this July 4th was so meaningful, and Isaiah touched on it in our chat before. Like, what is this July 4th showing us? What is this mass shooting in Chicago showing us? Is it showing us like the anger and upheaval that the people are feeling right now? Is it showing us like where we need to make new choices? Because like it's kind of like counterintuitive to think about like being angry on a day of like celebration like that. But yeah, let me know, US citizens, what do you feel about that?
Yeah, I feel like you guys have like woven it together really, really elegantly, you know, what this is about. It's really awesome and poetic what you've done. Because like, yeah, 4th of July, everyone is like, this is a day about independence and freedom. And then we're just talking about freedom. So like, yeah, like with the right to make decisions about your body, you know, when it comes to like carrying on a pregnancy or not, or terminating it. Yeah, that's an issue of freedom, you know, and it's okay like that the country, yeah, like it's safe to like, you know, love and the United States or love your country, whatever it is, and like have compassion for it and have like acceptance for it, but without accepting the stuff that isn't divine about what's going on in it, you know? And it's okay though. I think it's safe to be where the country is at, and it's safe to let the country as a collective move through the lessons they're moving through. Granted, as an individual, you don't have to choose for it to learn the lesson in a really like intense or like painful way. You don't have to. But yeah, I think that's what we're going through. Is it's a question of like freedom, like what is real freedom, you know? Because like, is it being able to do whatever you want regardless of the costs to you and all these people who who you're one with, or is it not? And I think that's maybe what we're seeing with the shooting, is it's showing that, like, perhaps I don't know what kind of weapon was used for that for that shooting, but it seemed to be one where you could like fire off a lot of rounds really quickly. So that's bringing up again, like, so is that, is it true freedom that almost anyone can get their hands on a weapon like that? And then we're seeing again with that like celebrity who was saying like Independence Day in quotes. Well, do you really have freedom if you can't make a decision legally about what happens, right, with your body? And so I think the US is just like getting clear about like what freedom means, and yeah, that kind of thing. And like there's the whole question of like, imposing, are you trying to impose your beliefs upon someone else and control someone else? Or are you doing like what is truly best for the collective? And it's not like a cut and dry thing. Like, it's something you have to really feel into and get clear on, like what is the truth in it. Yeah, because yeah, it's true. Like, it's not like you can't like say, oh, the US is individualist, this other country is like collectivist, and it's all about the whole, like, you can make generalizations, because I feel like it's so fair to say the US is very individualistic, but you know what I mean? Like, we have to like be nuanced about this and stuff. I think sometimes people hide behind abstract principles like that, and it needs to be like, you need to feel into like the particular situation, like what here is like actual freedom, so yeah.
Yeah, I feel like true freedom is when like life is valued, when like that's valued above, sorry, this light keeps going on and off. When life is valued, actually valued, like above these other costs or whatever benefits. Like, no, life needs to be valued first above all things. And I feel like that's true freedom, and that's kind of what we are upheaving, is like, where are we not choosing to actually value life? Like, with all, like with is, I think that's the thread that's kind of going through all these topics today, like with the immigration, with the mass shooting, and then with the shooting of Jalen Walker too, is like, where are we not valuing life, and where are we, like, with all these things happening, I feel like that choice is being presented to us now, like as a nation, as a global citizens, like, do you choose to value life here instead, so that we can let go of continuing to see these, terrible things happening,
I like that you shared that, and I think it's something that came up a few weeks ago as well. And for me, it goes even deeper than just that, than valuing life. I feel like it goes deeper into actually choosing life. Like, for me, it's almost a little bit of death to have to leave home. It's almost a little bit of death not to have autonomy over your body. It's a little bit of death not to have the freedom to choose what happens in the place that you live. So I feel like it just at the core, there's that choice to have or to choose life. Because once you choose life, you then can start to really unpack and weigh the balance of what is a cost versus a benefit in your life. And I know we have all done it in various forms, and we have all learned how to release in various forms the things that cost us our peace. Because the fact is, if it costs you your peace, it's too expensive. So if gun control is costing us the peace to live in safety, it's too expensive. If lawmakers are costing us the choice to have autonomy over our bodies, it's too expensive. You know, and that's literally, there's a balance. There's always a balance. If it's costing me my peace, I don't want it in my life. I'm going to walk away from it. If it's costing me feeling alive, I'm going to walk away from it. And that's how we start to value our lives. If there's too much of a cost, it just is not worth it.
Yeah, 100%. I don't even have anything else to say. It's yeah, that should be the metric basically for choosing and for true freedom, you know. Like here as humanists, we learned that true freedom is gained from actually like relinquishing that, you know, because like God knows best, and you have to follow this, and it feels like non-freedom for some, but when you start doing that, you realize that actually it is freedom, because you gain freedom in your vibration, and your life, you know, vibes up from it. But for people who don't have that metric, like freedom should be like what is the cost of things? Like, does this cost me my freedom? Does this cost me like my life? And in what ways, you know? And yeah, that's all I have to say about it.
And I think it's important for us to have that type of metric, because one of the things that I recall from a sermon that Jeff and Shaleia shared on addiction was, what is that addiction costing you? You know, is it giving to you, or is it taking away from you? And so we have to just ask ourselves, under all of these circumstances, when we read these things, and in the places that we live in, what is it taking away from me? Because if it's not adding life to my life, it's taking away life from my life. And so it almost becomes the energy of a no-brainer that, you know, it's not worth it. It doesn't deserve to stay. And I think that's kind of, and we don't reduce life to that type of metric, because we may think that it's a transactional way of living, but it's not. It's literally, is this adding life to my life or taking life away from my life? And I can't imagine that there's many people that are going to put up their hands and say, oh, I'm in, take some life away from me. Like, you know, I don't imagine that would be the mentality of people. Like, at the core of it, I think people have a desire to live. Some of them may not know how to execute on that desire, but I think at the core, most people do actually have a desire to live.
Yeah, and I feel like, you know, with what you're saying, like nobody would raise their hand and be like, yeah, like I want to shave off some life and not into it, you know. But I think that the reason that those decisions, those choices do get made, or they stay, is just because people cover, like we can sometimes like cover it up, you know, like obviously we're not thinking about it in terms of that, we're thinking about it in other terms, like maybe trying to ignore the cost or ignore, you know, the part where your peace is or your life is getting like drained or taken away, you know, maybe minimizing that or trying to like think it away or only focus on the perceived benefit, right? And I think it's interesting, and maybe it's something that could be applied to gun control, because it's like, you know, if it seems like sometimes the potential freedom of like being able to buy whatever weapon you want or defend yourself against, I don't know what it would be, is being like weighed higher than the risk and the cost of like having these people who are seriously mentally disturbed have like these weapons, you know what I mean? So I think that it's kind of rationalized away or thought away in terms of like, oh, well, that would never happen to me, or I would never have this situation, you know, or some other thing like that, when it does like happen a lot. And even if it's not you directly impacted by it, it doesn't like feel good to live in a society where like there is that kind of, you know what I mean, like rampant kind of violence, you know. And so it's just something to think about. I think it's because the real cost and is disguised, or the real benefit is kind of like over emphasized, you know what I mean? So I think that's what drives all of this. Yeah. So anyway.
When you talked, I thought illusion.
Yeah.
Society is definitely like healing that illusion of a certain benefit to like violence, or having an overabundance of things like guns.
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah. And it's just, it's like, it's interesting. I think it's a cultural thing, because I just wanted to share this because it popped up like with Ukraine. Like it'd be awesome if the Ukrainians, or rather the Ukrainian government, had a huge store of weapons, because they live by this really aggressive, predatory, you know, dictatorship, Russia, like a tyrannical ruler. So yeah, it'd be a good idea to be able to defend yourself. But I think in the US, the mentality is more like everybody should be able to own that type of stuff. And it's just, it's different. It's very culturally different, you know, it's very culturally different. So it's, yeah, just something that we're learning, I guess. So
at some point, I would actually really love the question to be, what purpose does it serve to have an ordinary citizen be able to outright purchase an assault rifle? What, are they going to invade their neighbor's backyard? Are they going to form a perimeter around a swimming pool? What the hell is the purpose? You know, like you have to ask the question, like, what is the purpose of actually having an assault rifle? What is the attraction of actually having an assault rifle? Like, you know, you kind of have to ask the question, like, what the hell are you doing with it? What are you hoping to achieve with it?
Well, supposedly the assault rifles are not as, you know, it's not as permitted to buy them as like little guns. No, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
To my knowledge, I'm aware that they're used for hunting, but that's all I know. I don't know anything else.
Like, about really an automatic rifle used for hunting? What are you gonna turn the thing that you're hunting into a whole riddled piece of meat? What are you trying to achieve here?
yeah,
Like,
well,
It's like like I know the question sounds ridiculous, but if you put it in that kind of context, you really have to wonder what purpose does it serve. Like, I do not want a state that has 10 gunshot wound holes in it, kind of thing.
Yeah.
I know it sounds ridiculous, and it's probably as ludicrous as that to even have access to it. Like, you're literally not gonna go and invade the neighborhood over. What do you need it for?
Right. Well, because it's not honoring, it lacks respect for that thing. Like, you have to respect that thing. Like, this weapon has this high capacity to inflict harm or to kill. Like, that's not respecting that thing and what it is. Because it's not something to be taken lightly, as much as some people might feel that way, and as much as that might be normalized, it's just not, so it reminds me of like I was mentioning, like maybe like the government or the local military depot might want to have weapons if there's a credible threat of invasion, like we were talking about China and Taiwan or Russia and Ukraine. But in terms of like owning that weapon for like no purpose other than your personal use for like hunting, it's just like, I don't know if that's respecting the weapon and respecting life, because it's a big deal to have that, in my opinion. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I like that you brought that up, because it leads us into a question around people respecting the power that they actually have.
Mm-hmm.
Because literally you have the freedom to own something that has that much destructive power. Do we then respect all these rights that have been started to be taken for granted? Like, people have fought for freedom. People have fought for their independence. People have sacrificed things for their independence. And now we are in a space where we are so free that we no longer respect life, and we no longer respect our rights. I mean, and in essence, if we really went to the core of it, does it speak to a lack of respect for yourself?
I mean, it might. I think the answer is yes, because we know that inflicting harm on something else in creation, on another human being, is like inflicting harm on ourselves. So, and yeah, when you have something of that capacity to provoke harm in your hands, you have a responsibility with it. So obviously, yeah, there's obviously something that you're breaching, that you're not respecting, if that kind of violence happens.
Yeah. Yes, there's a dog barking outside our house.
It's around about the same time as last week.
I know. Dogs are always barking at the end. Yeah. The dogs are a great example, because they're very on it. Like, they will defend their territory. and they want their territory respected. So yeah, anyway, I thought that was interesting. I also wanted to ask if we wanted to talk about something similar, like we mentioned, you know, China and Taiwan and the whole relationship there that's going on, you know, just briefly, because I found it was really, excuse me, I found it was really interesting that the US's policy has been interesting because they've been like, the US has a law that imposes on itself that it must give Taiwan weapons. Like we were talking about this, it must arm Taiwan as necessary for Taiwan to defend itself. And yet the US doesn't even recognize Taiwan as being a country. And it says like there's really only one Chinese government. Yeah. So Taiwan technically isn't a free country of its own. And yet, you know what I mean? It's interesting how that's been ambiguous. And then, you know, it's so interesting how then, you know, President Biden, when he was asked if would the US like militarily help defend Taiwan if China invaded, he just like flat out just said yes, period. When the US's stance on that has been, it's literally called strategic ambiguity, meaning like we don't want to invite the possibility that we would get into a military conflict with China, but we also don't want to just tell China, oh, it's okay, go ahead and move on Taiwan. And I just find that so, you know, it's like, it's one of those situations where I feel like it won't be that way. Strategic ambiguity is not going to be there forever. Because if China goes in that direction of like being increasingly like they want conquest, or they're very like tyrannical, they're going to test that, you know, and it's just weird to me. So I just wondered if you guys wanted to speak about it at the last few minutes here.
Yeah, we like literally have 2 or 3 minutes to go.
I know. I just wanted to mention.
I do have to agree with you that it sounds very much like a strategic play, and for me, it almost seems like there's a level of protection because there's a depth of the relationship that we don't fully understand, because that same protection has not been so verbalized for Ukraine.
Oh, that's true. Oh, yeah, that's true. Mm-hmm.
It hasn't been that verbalized. So there's a lot of United Nations, NATO, those kind of things, all strategically having conversations and imposing sanctions. There's a lot of military support in various ways, but it has not been that decisive. So I have to wonder, what is the depth of the relationship with Taiwan for the US to be that decisive in its answer?
I know. And the relationship with China too, though, to have that ambiguity. But I don't feel good about like looking at the US military and being like, go defend those people, go fight this war, go fight that war. Because it's not like respecting their life and the preciousness of our own military. Like Taiwan would have to like defend itself too. You know, they would have to be like, you know, with Afghanistan, like the Afghan people had to choose, you know, what they wanted in their country. But yeah, I don't know. That's not something that I know a whole lot about.
Yeah, but I also think there's a little bit of the energy of the big brother. Like sometimes the big brother actually does need to step up in order to assist in standing up to the bully. It's just one of those things.
I think Taiwan is like kind of like, you know, tied together because as we don't have like full recognition of the whole wide world as a nation, it was just supposed to be like kind of a replacement when China was full-on communist, and still China is still communist. So the world is still using Taiwan as a kind of a, I don't know, guards, security. I don't know how to explain this, but like, how do they defend themselves as not fully independent at the same time? Because like, and something's gotta give, and whichever way it goes, I feel it's gonna not be good because China is gonna be angry, but the situation can stay like this forever. But this is all I have to say. So this was like geopolitics 101 very fast, but yeah, we can talk about that later.
Yeah.
So in that sense, we're going to say thank you to everybody for today and invite everybody to like and subscribe to our Church of Union YouTube channel for our previous conversations. And we will see all of you next week. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.